And so we begin now with our first presenter, and our first presenter is wonderful and extraordinary Christina Kwauk. You do have a description of who she is in the bios in your program, but basically she is a world expert on girls' education in developing countries, and she is a 21st century skills and youth empowerment person. She is working with the intersections of gender education and climate change, and is co-authored What Works in Girls' Education. She is also incredible in her ability to serve on the Girls Rising Advisory Council and the International Jury for UNESCO. She is a woman's education and formerly head in climate change education at the Education Commission. So without further ado, we would like to present to you Christina Kwauk.
But thank you so much for having me here today and for inviting me here to speak with you all at your event. I'm sorry I could not join you all in person. I am calling to you all from the Piscataway lands here outside of Washington, D.C. It's my pleasure to be with you all this, I guess, morning your time, afternoon my time, to really get a chance to talk to you all about a topic that has really become the sole focus of my professional life these days. And that is around marshaling the evidence and practice to help decision makers recognize the intersection between gender, education, and climate change, and to accelerate education for climate action and climate justice that centers girls and women. So I should also caveat, provide some caveats at the beginning of my remarks saying that, I haven't been doing this work all my life. My entree into this work was rather serendipitous. I began my sort of journey to this work as a fellow at a prestigious think tank in Washington, D.C., where I was doing my work on gender equality and education. And in that role, I was, in a sort of a think tank role, trying to pull together the evidence of what works in girls' education and all of this to try to convince world leaders of why we needed to see an increase in global investments in girls' education. There's so much evidence there, higher levels of girls' education, and I think everyone in Sir Optimus understands this, is strongly associated with so many benefits, right? Increased economic empowerment, reductions in early and forced child marriage, increased agency, increased agricultural productivity, better maternal and infant health outcomes, right? There's so many positive benefits to educating girls. But as I was doing that work, one summer I was in a meeting with a former world leader. We were coming together to discuss a new girls' education initiative that we were spearheading together. And she asked me a completely innocuous question, which is, what is the potential impact of climate change on girls' education? And I, at that time, had no idea. Surely it would threaten all the progress we had made as a global girls' education community. But what was the evidence of this? And did the girls' education community even know this? And did we need to bring us all together and really tackle this, lest all of our progress made over the last several decades just completely get unraveled, right? So here I was kind of in this moment of sort of an existential researcher crisis here, where I was really trying to understand what is the impact of climate change on girls' education. And I began exploring this question, and I was just really shocked at what I was seeing in the research. But so in my research, and when we think about climate change, we oftentimes think that climate change doesn't discriminate when it comes to wreaking its havoc on the planet, right? But when we look at who is impacted the most, those who are most acutely affected by climate change happen to be the most vulnerable and least skilled members of society. When we look at low and middle income country contexts, many of which also happen to be highly climate vulnerable countries, when we talk about who are the most vulnerable and least skilled members of society, we're often talking about girls and women. And I think it's no new news to this group that things like strict and constraining gender norms that are that structure girls and women's lives mean that they're less exposed to life-saving information. They're less exposed to skills and resources that could potentially improve their adaptive capacity and their ability to interpret early warning signals, all because they're excluded from participating in household and community decision-making and public spaces where this information is passed, and as a result have lower life expectancy in the face of natural disasters. And research that sort of woke me up to the extent of this shows that girls and women can make up to as much as 90% of those killed in weather-related disasters. And then those who survive are highly vulnerable to human trafficking and sexual assault during post-disaster recovery in crowded shelters or in temporary camps. And then when we think about, both prolonged and short-term weather-related crises, our household coping mechanisms, which are informed by our beliefs about gender and our beliefs about, capacities and all of this, also put girls at higher risk of school withdrawal in order to help have them help complete household responsibilities during times of drought, for example, and the need to fetch water, which oftentimes falls on the shoulders of women, means that they don't have time to study, they don't have time to go to school. We also see household coping mechanisms that force girls into early child marriage because their dowries are seen to help potentially ease the burden of stretching scarce resources across multiple family members. So when we think about, how does climate change impact society, we can see that because of unequal gender norms and gender inequality, a lot of our responses to climate change can threaten the course of girls' futures and perpetuate their marginalization and their vulnerabilities in ways that have long-lasting intergenerational impact. Right. So this is all of what I was learning from the research. But at the same time, I was writing this book that was all about why we should be investing in girls' education. And, while of course, there were these damaging effects of climate change on girls and women, I knew from my research that surely well-educated girls and women could be a powerful part of the solution. And so luckily, through that additional research that I was doing, and now my professional life's work, there are not just one reason, but there's 3 really great reasons why we should be investing in girls' education as a climate strategy. And so the first reason is that when we think about quality, transformative, empowering education for girls and boys, and especially one that includes comprehensive sexuality and reproductive health education, this kind of education strengthens girls' sense of agency, her self-efficacy, bodily autonomy, as well as her sexual and reproductive health and rights. And we look at this at a global level, data suggests that there is a very strong positive association between the average amount of schooling a girl receives in her country and her country's scores on indices that measure vulnerability to climate-related disasters. And so much of that relationship is grounded on the evidence that increased years of schooling for girls helps to deter early and forced child marriage. It delays the first age of birth, and it allows girls and women to enter into economic lives of productivity. And so in the context of climate change, this is sort of the bare minimum level of progress in outcomes for girls and women that is associated with increased levels of empowerment and agency and higher levels of resilience in the face of climate shocks. So this is the bare minimum we should be achieving, ensuring that girls have the opportunity to go to school and receive this empowering education. And so many of you might be familiar with a solution. This solution, girls' education, tied together with the rights-based voluntary family planning, has been highlighted by folks like Project Drawdown as one of the most powerful climate solutions in terms of its potential to help us as a society, global society, reduce our global carbon emissions. The second reason why girls' education is a powerful climate strategy is that quality education plays a vital role in fostering girls' leadership and women's capacity to participate in climate decision-making. Again, from the research, we know the importance of formal education and mentorship in the trajectories of women into corporate and political leadership positions. But now we also know that there's a clear linkage between women's leadership and pro-environmental outcomes. So countries with greater representation of women in parliament, greater political empowerment of women in general, are more likely to ratify environmental treaties. They're more likely to have bolder and more stringent climate policies, and they're even more likely to have lower carbon footprints. So at a more local level, when girls and women are better educated and included in decision-making at all levels, their families and their communities are also better able to plan for and cope with and rebound from climate crises. So this is a really, really important reason for investing in girls' education as a climate strategy. And finally, the last reason, the third reason, is that quality girls' education plays a critical role in ensuring that girls develop a breadth of green skills that are not only important to adapt to and navigate a climate impacted world, but also to adapt to and navigate a changing world of work that is intended to be a greener world of work, right? So this is important because given the marginalization of women to the fringes of our present fossil fuel driven economies, if our green sector industries become the driving economic force that they've been projected to become, then centering girls and women in that transition will be absolutely vital to their inclusion in this alternative, regenerative, and more inclusive economic system that we are trying to build. So this is what I wanted to set us up with my remarks in terms of just, three really important reasons why we should be investing in girls' education as a climate strategy. And my call to action to you all is to identify those opportunities to make that intersection a priority in the work that you all do. So thank you so much, Janet. I think maybe I've used up my 7 minutes. I'll turn it back to you.
You did, and we're staying on time. In fact, the question that I was going to ask you, you already answered. If we can just ask you, just take a minute to ask this question is, what are the barriers to pursuing these that you want to address? If you could just take a minute to do that.
Yeah. So I think one of the key barriers that I'm seeing at sort of a global policy level is sort of around the hesitation to invest in girls' education as a climate strategy. And I think part of this is, again, another sort of three reasons kind of response is that we oftentimes get overly focused on the number of emitters on the planet, which can distract us from attending to how we are contributing to overall emissions. And I think that oftentimes when we talk about girls' education as a climate strategy, oftentimes we begin to recirculate and resurface very old, very ethically dicey conversations around population. And I think it's vitally important as a community, as a community focused on girls' education and women's empowerment, that we are very clear in our messaging that we're not necessarily focused on the number of emitters, but how we are emitting. Because as countries and as society becomes really savvy about a carbon accounting, we can very easily miss the point of girls' education and climate as a climate strategy, because we start to get caught up in a numbers game where, populations that are decreasing their direct emissions may be just simply offshoring their emissions. And this, getting in the way again of sort of our focus on why we are focused on girls' education. And I think the second reason, or second barrier, is that, when we think about the girls' education climate nexus, oftentimes our current models are based on just the number of years of schooling. And so we then focus on just ensuring that girls are getting into school and staying in school, which doesn't oftentimes translate into learning in empowering ways, right? You could be in school learning that your role is in the kitchen. And that's not going to be any better than having been outside of school. So I think we have to really consider that. The learning, that being in school doesn't equate to learning. And then the final one is that, again, the scientific models are based on known relationships between girls' education and the delay in early marriage, the delay in early childbearing. And so the fulcrum of this relationship is around fertility. But I think all of us in this room know that fertility cannot be the only mechanism through which girls' education is a solution. So I think it's really important for us as a global community to really emphasize again that that fertility is a positive outcome of investing in girls' education, but it's not the reason why we are investing in girls' education. And that, again, simply staying in school longer doesn't guarantee reduced fertility. There are so many other factors that influence that. So I wanted to just sort of like make sure that we have that in mind as we think about this nexus and ensure that our communication is very clear. Thanks.
Question for Christina online. With respect to the hesitation in investing in girls' education at the global policy level, what are some reasons for this, and what could we in our community do about it?
Thanks for that question. So Yes, I mean, there is such there's a huge gap when it comes to global climate policy. We've done analyses of 2 rounds of nationally determined contributions, which are countries' national climate strategies that they have committed to creating and monitoring and tracking as part of the Paris Agreement. And we've done an analysis twice on not only the first round of NDCs, but the second updated and revised NDCs. And between the first and the second rounds, we saw no improvement when it came to the inclusion of girls' education as a climate strategy. I mean, granted, when I think the time period between those 2 rounds, I think the advocacy around gender and climate intersections was growing, and so there was certainly a lot more improvement when it came to inclusion of women and other broader gender issues when it comes to climate mitigation and adaptation. But the education side of it has been lacking. And I think a big part of this is, one, I mean, the education sector and its sort of advocacy to the climate sector really didn't pick up until maybe about 18 months ago, 2 years ago, perhaps. And I think what we need to see more of is that kind of advocacy at a country level to ensure that not only are girls and women part of global policy decision-making tables, and especially because the nationally determined contributions are supposed to be a participatory process, and ensuring that girls and women are at those community consultations when governments are putting together their climate policies is so critical, because then we can also be advocating for not just an awareness of the gender intersections when it comes to agriculture, when it comes to the economy, but critically to education and what that means when we're talking about ensuring that generations to come are equipped with these, not only the skills needed for greener, lower carbon economies, but that we also have the gender equal mindsets and really center women and girls empowerment in those transitions that are happening. So I think it's definitely more advocacy that's needed. I think it's ensuring that, especially in perhaps communities that you're working with, countries that you're working with, is finding ways to create opportunities for girls and women to attend these community consultations, so that their views are reflected and the issues that are important to them, like education, are reflected in there. So, thanks.
This question is for Christina. Christina, I just wonder if you could speak a bit about the importance or the impact of education on climate action in developed countries. In my reading of Project Drawdown, I think it amazed me at how much of the impact could be felt in developed countries. So if you could speak to that.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's so important to, when we're talking about climate and education intersections, to have in mind where in the world we're talking about those intersections, because I think the contributions, while they are universal in terms of the positive impact it can have, are very nuanced when it comes to where we're talking about. So in high emitting country context, the importance of climate education and ensuring that climate education is both gender transformative, socially inclusive, oriented to climate justice. Like, these are vitally important, not only when we're talking about emissions, but when we're talking about ensuring that these transitions to greener economies are just and center those communities who have been historically marginalized, historically underinvested, and everything. So, so when it comes to thinking about, what is the potential impact, I mean, what we need to do in our sort of in high industrialized countries is need to break the relationship between high levels of education and high levels of consumption. Because what we see once we pass a certain threshold of development, that relationship between education and emissions is a negative one. So higher levels of education equate with higher levels of income, which equates with higher levels of consumption and therefore higher levels of emissions. But what we don't understand is, if we were to change the quality of that education, if we were to ensure that all children and youth we're learning about climate change, about the human causes of climate change, about the impact and the unequal impact, that relationship, we could essentially decouple that relationship between education and emissions. We don't know, we haven't seen that. We don't have evidence of that, but I think that that is the underlying intuition of the importance of climate change education. So I think barring, the actual evidence of this, I think we have emerging evidence that is using self-reported data, that's sort of using projected modeling. It's not perfect, but it allows us to see what potential that is. So just to give you an example, some work by Eugene Cordero and his colleagues in California looked at modeling just 16% of high school students or high school and college students in high income country context receiving a quality climate change education could actually have an enormous amount, even I think it was like 69 gigatons or so of, no, I could be wrong with that one. That's okay, but it's an enormous amount of carbon emissions that are reduced and avoided. It is better than wind turbines. It's better than our electric vehicles. It's powerful, right? And it's because of the potential for that education to change mindsets, to change decisions, to change behaviors, and so on. So yeah, and sorry, I can't quote the number because it's left my head, but yeah, it's very important.
Hey, Christina, stats in Canada around food wastage is 58% of food that's grown in Canada is thrown away.
Oh, God.
And that comes from Food Wastage Nonprofit Organization out of Vancouver. So next time you go to the grocery store, buy the bruised apple instead of the nice shiny one, because guess what? The bruised one's going to get thrown in the garbage. So
I just want to give a standing,
gratitude and gratefulness to our team today of exceptional climate change experts doing things that are making a difference. And the call to you is go home to your club and find a way to do something around bringing our young people in around climate change. And the sacred scientist, Diana Beresford Kroger, when asked the question, what's the one thing I can do? She said, we all need to hold hands together and say a blessing for this world. So if you do that and then do something in your club, it will make a huge difference.